Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor Jon V. Kofas is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome. This is an analytical session on Europe's foreign policy toward Israel. Officially, the United Nations recognizes 44 countries, one of which, by the way, a lot of people would not probably agree or not be aware of this, is Russia, which the UN considers a European country, although it is a Eurasian country. It's in two continents, Europe and Asia. In any event, really, when we are talking about Europe, we are talking about the core countries in Europe, especially Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, although Italy has played a key role as a major weapon supplier to Israel during the execution of its war since October 2023. That is a war that the International Court of Justice, as well as UN rapporteurs, have described as a war of genocide, not a conventional war as we would think, like World War II or World War I, but rather a genocidal war, a war carried out in Gaza against the civilian populations. The question, of course, is about Europe's foreign policy, which those who follow political events know that Europe has been following the position of the United States with regard to Israel during the Biden administration, just as it followed the foreign policy of the United States in Ukraine, in fact, being very loyal to the United States, in both of these wars, Ukraine as well as Israel. What has happened that has changed all of this? According to and as a rather analytical and thoughtful report in Newsweek magazine, the American magazine Newsweek, in June 2025, a recent report, Israel is becoming increasingly isolated in the global arena. Not that it was not isolated even during the Biden administration, but it is getting mixed signals from the Trump administration, especially since Trump made the trip with business people in May in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. And during that trip, by the way, actually, I think it was like right during the announcement that he would be leaving for the Gulf states visit, official visit, which of course he promoted as a visit that would bring trillions of dollars in Arab investment to the United States. He also announced, by the way, the end of the US campaign to defeat the Houthi rebels ideologically linked to Iran in Yemen. Something that, of course, did not sit well with Israel, especially considering that the Trump administration had also been pursuing nuclear talks, which are stalled, by the way. We have no idea where that's going. But it had been pursuing nuclear talks with Iran. Iran basically negotiating not to have nuclear weapons. As many Iranian officials have stated repeatedly over the years, if they wanted nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, they could have and would have had them. But they are willing to trade the end of economic sanctions, somewhat of a normalization of relations, especially in the question of trade relations with the Western world, including Europe. Europe has been getting mixed signals, and Newsweek magazine was right that the global isolation of Israel and the mixed signals that it's getting from the Trump administration. Although the Trump administration, by the way, to be sure, and the more evidence we see, the more we're convinced that from what we know, there's classified material, obviously, we don't know about, that the Trump administration is just as pro-Israel, Netanyahu as the Biden administration, unquestionably so. Now, there is I mean, Europe has had a long-standing history of anti-Semitism, a 1,000-year history of anti-Semitism, especially as many scholars, including Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, tracing European anti-Semitism to the Black Death in 1348, which breaks out in 1348. So all the way down to the Holocaust during the Third Reich. On the other hand, from 1948 to the present, Europe has more or less followed the Cold War pattern of the United States in its relations with Israel. The 1956 Suez Canal crisis, where the Europeans meddled in that against Egypt during the reign of President Nasser in Egypt, that was an aberration. In that case, the Soviet Union back then, as well as the United States, were actually on the same side, and they brought some stability to that. But other than that, the fact is that Europe has followed faithfully and blindly, I should say, the United States with regard to policy in Israel. The question is, what has happened since Trump took over that all of this is going on? I think that we have a number of issues here that are very pertinent, and that is the Trump administration's demands that Europe carry its own weight militarily. There was even just this past week a meeting with NATO defense ministers. The U.S. Secretary of Defense was there. Again, he reiterated the Trump administration's long-standing policy. This goes back to the first Trump administration, 2017 to 2021, where the U.S. believes that Europe should carry its own weight, that is, not leech off the U.S., not depend on the U.S. to carry it, and have the U.S. have the burden of defense spending to defend Europe anymore. Those days are long gone. Europe is developed. It's part of the core of the world economy, capitalist economy. And that's one dimension. The second dimension is the U.S. administration, the Trump administration, demanding a rise in the in NATO spending for each NATO member from 3% to 5%. Now, that is a considerable amount. There are very, very few countries. I believe Greece is one of them. I forget which other country. There are not many, one or two in NATO that actually go at or above 3%. Well, Trump wants 5%. And of course, the expectation is that the Europeans buy weapons from the United States. I should tell you, parenthetically, it was a very interesting story. I don't remember if I read it in one of the major newspapers in the United States or in an Asian newspaper, but actually the Trump administration is making the same demands bilaterally to other countries. It's asking other countries to spend more on defense and buy U.S. weapons. So it's not that surprising. And of course, when in May 2025, just a few weeks ago, when the Trump administration officials, as well as businessmen, went to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates, one of the issues they pushed was weapons purchases by the Arabs, more weapon sales to the Arab countries, regardless of what the Democrats are cautioning. What are you doing selling more weapons to countries that are authoritarian and upsetting the regional balance of power strategically there? Okay, so that is one issue that the Trump administration has been pressuring the Europeans. The other issue is that the Europeans have felt the enormity of Trump's pressure on the issue of economic nationalism. Everyone knows about Trump's tariffs, back and forth, This yo-yo policy, instability is not something the markets like, by the way. Business people, corporations, from small businesses to large businesses, by the way, as many analysts and politicians have pointed out, they have deep pockets. They can send some of the yo-yo policies in Washington, but smaller businesses cannot. They have to do some planning. And the tariff policy of back and forth, 10%, 50%, pause on tariffs, tariff war again, all of this with China as the main focus of the United States has obviously caused a lot of damage to Europe, not to mention, of course, that the Europeans have not been at all enthralled with the United States wanting to seize Greenland, which the Europeans, of course, consider part of Denmark, and Denmark is in Europe, and they feel an affinity, they feel friendship with Denmark, and feel that this unilateral move will just take it, just like they want to take the Panama Canal, reduce, although that rhetoric has died down now, reduce Canada to the 51st state. Such statements, even with Canada, the fact is that Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, is more in tune with the Europeans, and they are in tune with Canada. And this has upset this bilateral relationship of Trump going to country by country instead of pursuing multilateral policies, that is collective diplomacy and consultation. The other thing that has upset him, of course, is what he's done with Ukraine. They feel they have sacrificed enormously for what the United States asked them to do with regard to Ukraine, namely support NATO expansion eastward into the Black Sea, Transcaucasus countries, and into Central Asia. And Europeans feel that they have faithfully supported Ukraine during the Biden administration. Here comes Trump, and he changes foreign policy. It's not that he changed foreign policy, it's that he unilaterally goes off and negotiates with Ukraine and Russia and sort of dictates this approach. This is about diplomatic protocol, of course, and how foreign policy from President Wilson back in World War I to the present is supposed to be conducted with the junior partners of the United States, namely the Europeans. Europeans were not exactly, as people who follow these things know, were not exactly happy with the situation, considering that they sacrificed enormously during the Ukraine war. And then on top of that, they have, of course, the situation in Gaza, Israel, in October 2023, going after Gaza. And the brunt of the cost for all that went to the working people of Europe and to the middle class, as inflationary pressures were exacerbated, considering that COVID-19 lingering effects as a result of supply chain bottlenecks had already put a chokehold on European economy, very slow growth in Europe. And we have further problems and yet the Europeans supported both the Ukraine war and the war in Israel. And a lot of people felt, well, that the Europeans made these sacrifices to be loyal to the United States, their senior ally. Well, actually, it's European corporations that were pushing for that. European corporations were the ones. There were specific European corporations, specific European interests that benefited. Now there were also those that were harmed, by the way. Clearly, when Nord Stream 2 pipeline was blown up in the North Sea, I won't go into speculation about what happened there, but if people are interested, you can read online who was behind it. In any case, the energy prices went up, and energy prices sent higher basic goods, and then sanctions on Russia on top of that, and Europe depended very heavily on certain Russian raw materials, not just energy. Never mind that by the way, that the Europeans were receiving some of the natural gas and oil clandestinely through third parties from shipping companies from Greece to India. Okay, that aside, the fact is that the impact on the European economy, and when I say European economy, I mean the working class and the middle class, was very bad. Now, they were still, however, willing to go along with supporting the war in Israel, no matter what the reports were about what Israel was doing in Gaza. The Europeans were willing to go along with that. And no matter the public knowledge that Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, was doing this, according to the Israeli press as well as the world press, was pursuing the forever war doctrine of the United States because it was in his own personal interest, namely because he was in legal trouble. And as soon as that war stopped, as soon as there was a permanent ceasefire and a settlement, some kind of a permanent settlement, he would have to face a court hearing. He would have to go to court and face all sorts of charges. Some people may be aware of that of his long-standing history with the law. Anyway, the other problem with the Europeans and the United States, and why they began to modify their position, is that Europe, according to the United States, there are 44 countries, but really the core countries, Northwest Europe, is really historically those core countries are the deciding countries, while the periphery countries in Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, really don't have much of a say. And as long as Germany, France, the United Kingdom were in solidarity, they felt that that they were loyal to the U.S. and they would help out in this war, no matter what the International Criminal Court said, no matter what the International Court of Justice said, no matter what the United Nations said, no matter what world public opinion said about Israel's genocidal war. And by the way, and I'll give you at the very end, I'll give you some candid admission by the former spokesperson of the State Department, Matthew Miller, under Joe Biden, who recently gave an interview to Sky News in the United Kingdom, admitting the knowledge and, in fact, agreement that, in fact, behind the scenes, they knew this was genocidal war. And this is not just them, by the way. Recently, we have seen in Israeli press former Israeli government officials come out and ask the rhetorical question: If this is not, if these are not war crimes over there in Gaza, what do we call them? Um, these are not Hamas people. These are not jihadists. These are former Israeli officials who are coming out and telling the press, what do we call what has been happening here in Gaza? What name do we give all of this? So the Europeans have had many reasons to wonder what is going on. Now, there's something else here that's happening. World public opinion and world government opinion. When you look at the United Nations General Assembly, not the Security Council where the US has a veto and vetoes resolutions in favor of ceasefire and providing humanitarian aid, but the General Assembly, all members are represented. When you look at that, what you find is the real opinion of the conflict in Israel. The majority of the countries in the world that have recognized Palestine, by the way, and more Europeans are leaning in that direction. Some European countries have already recognized it, but more and more European countries are leaning in that direction. There you find enormous pressure on the Europeans. Now, there is a lot of hypocrisy here, by the way, and there is no doubt about that, because countries that say, including China has been on the side of Russia and Iran and the Palestinian people. In terms of rhetoric, just like a number of Muslim countries, the rhetoric is fine, solidarity with the Palestinian people. But then when you look at trade statistics during the execution of this war, which is a genocidal war, even by the standards of former Israeli officials, and Matthew Miller, the latest one, former spokesperson for the State Department, now he agrees, genocide. Now, when you look at let's take China, because China is a major trading partner has been a major trading partner of Israel. China is a very important country. Number one trading partner country to the entire world. Number one manufacturer in the world. Number one shipper, country with the most shipping assets and port access in the world. Okay, there are, at any time there are about 120,000 ships or so in the oceans across the world. Most of those are either contracted to China or they are Chinese and are carrying Chinese product all over the world. China is a major trading asset for Israel. Now, China talks a good game at the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations Security Council. When its foreign ministry spokespeople come out, oh yes, solidarity with the Palestinians. In using Iran and its solidarity, and Iran is very heavily dependent, by the way, on China economically, strategically, geopolitically, in other words, on Russia, economically on China. So Russia and China, major partners with Iran. But what has China done? What tangible thing has China done to support the Palestinian people other than rhetoric? Yes, it has offered all kinds of proposals, but an undergraduate at Tel Aviv University can offer all kinds of proposals. In fact, at the very end, I will mention a very astute PhD Israeli student at Tel Aviv University, going a PhD candidate, who has written something recently about how to solve the situation. A very brilliant young man. Proposals to end are, they're all over. They're all over the UN. They're everywhere. What tangible steps has China taken, any more than Saudi Arabia, any more than Qatar, any more than many of with the exception of Iran and Yemen, any more than many of the Muslim countries. Nothing. When you look at trade statistics, what you find is that they are carrying out relations as though nothing happened. So the question is, when the Europeans look at all of this, why should they budge? The reason they did sort of a volte-face, about face, in other words, the French term about face, recently in the last few months, is really a combination of things, but it has to do a lot with the Trump administration and the anger of the Europeans and the uncertainty. It's not anger like Musk Trump anger, but the uncertainty of where Europe stands with regard to the United States and what it's going to do next. Obviously, the Europeans witnessed Trump going to the Gulf states and basically trying to secure as much money of Arab investment for the United States, compromising on Syria, compromising on Yemen, just to get the money, the investment, which, I'm just saying this is the way I'm just repeating how it's viewed. Now, where are the Europeans in all of this? Well, there are a number of things that have upset them, and those are the unilateral approach, the fact that they're left out, the fact that Trump is looking to secure the bulk of the reconstruction contracts in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian mineral assets, if there is a deal, we don't know. I mean, Trump had promised he would solve this in a day. And here we are, June 2025, and there's no solution to the Ukraine-Russian conflict. So the Europeans feel sort of betrayed, left out, and on top of it, punished by the United States. They're historic allies, co-founders of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Major trading partners. Okay, now we see some of this anger of the Europeans on June 4th, just a few days ago, 2025, at the United Nations Security Council. The Europeans decided to isolate the United States. They voted with Russia and China in demanding an immediate ceasefire and immediate humanitarian assistance in Gaza. They are well aware, as is the world, because we live in the age of instant communication, the age of high-tech communication systems, the age of telephone, pictures, and video, and so forth, which is communicated instantly all over the world. They know that what has happened is that the Israelis have done a couple of things that are not to their credit as civilized as they like to believe. They're the civilized state in the Middle East, and the Arabs, the Muslims, are the uncivilized ones. But they draw the population, mostly women and children and older people, by the way, they draw them to these humanitarian aid centers, and then they take them out. They shoot them. That report, it's not that it's mass shooting, but they target people in humanitarian aid areas. That is something that the Europeans are well aware of. Even worse, there was a recent story, to their credit, the Israeli media, the Israeli press, also other outlets picked it up. To their credit, like I said, exposed a Netanyahu-approved plan to support jihadist gangs in Gaza financially and with weapons. Okay, this is a recent story. Jihadist gangs claiming to be ideologically linked to ISIS, the terrorist organization operating Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and to use those gangs to create even more chaos, as though Gaza doesn't have enough chaos with this war, this genocidal war, and to steal humanitarian aid, and to deflect attention from the IDF, what the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is doing in Gaza, to these, to internally, well, look, the Arabs are fighting, the Palestinians are fighting amongst themselves, and all along, here's the thing that a number of European governments, including, by the way, Germany, very loyal to Israel historically, and rightly so, since they carried out the Holocaust during the Third Reich. The Europeans were not happy. No one was happy that to find out that this has been happening, and all along, the Israeli government was claiming that it was Hamas stealing humanitarian aid and disrupting humanitarian aid. And here they were financing these groups, these criminal gangs, essentially, inside Gaza, on the payroll and armed by the Netanyahu government. Now, none of this, how can, if you're Macron or Merz in Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, how can you possibly then go before your own citizens and defend Israel? It becomes very, very difficult. Even if you wanted to, it becomes very difficult. Because, like I said, we live in the age of high-tech communications. Information is instant. The sources for these stories, by the way, comes right out of Israel. Okay? Comes right out of Israel. So people know what is happening. And the question is, what do the Europeans do? They obviously have to modify their position, and they have to rethink what is in their own interest, rather than blindly following U.S. policy, which they're not sure where that's going, whether it's in economic policy, foreign economic policy, or geopolitical aspects of policy. Now, Europeans also follow public opinion polls. The Europeans, before I go to public opinion, let me explain a couple of other things that did not sit well with the Europeans. The State Department on June 4th, the same day that the United Nations Security Council had a 14-1 vote, the one was the US vetoing the resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza and to provide immediate humanitarian aid. The United States, under Trump, followed the exact same veto policy that the Biden administration followed. No difference. Biden, Trump, same policy. Okay, no difference at all. Now, on the same day, the State Department sanctioned 4 International Criminal Court justices, and it sanctioned them on the basis of 2 considerations. One was that they had issued warrants for top-level officials in the Israeli government as war criminals. And the second was the consideration of the ICC to look into war crimes in Afghanistan when the US was there for 20 years. That did not sit well with the State Department. So they issued sanctions. How dare you try to investigate war crimes against the US government, US Department of Defense during the Afghanistan war. This third thing that happened on June 4th, which is, all these things coincided, June 4th, 2025, is that Human Rights Watch, many people may be familiar with Human Rights Watch, it's an international human rights organization, issued a report. The report was about potential U.S. war crimes in Ras Isa port in Yemen. During the time that the Trump administration declared war on the Houthi rebels, okay, but actually targeted civilians. I had done a video on a video session, analytical video session on the role of the Houthis in Yemen and its wider implications with regard to the Middle East from Iran to the Gulf states. And I mentioned that the targets, I mentioned back then when it was happening that the targets were really civilian. Well, the Human Rights Watch group comes out and says on June 4th, they were civilian and civilians were targeted and civilians were killed. So that too was something that the Europeans had to take into account. All of these things they had to take into account, along with the fact, with the latest public opinion polls, that 73% of the Europeans, this is a huge number, by the way, okay, 3/4 of the European population mistrust the United States. And roughly as many, actually 10% less, 63, 64% of Europeans oppose Israel. Although when this war started in October 2023, majority of the Europeans were on the side of Israel. Now that all of that has changed. European governments can read public opinion polls. They know that the two countries that their own citizens are against are the United States and Israel. Okay. And so what we have is the considerable influence of the European public opinion at the same time that the Trump administration, from J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, to Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, to Trump himself, have been castigating the Europeans for not permitting freedom of the press to extend to far right-wing groups in Europe. They consider that a violation of the rights of freedom of speech for the far right. Now, European governments want to maintain, obviously, not all of them, not Giorgia Meloni in Italy, not the government in Hungary, not the government in Poland, but most of the Europeans, the core European countries, Northwest Europe, want to maintain the tradition of liberal democracy. It's a facade. Everybody knows it, because behind the so-called liberal democracy are neoliberal corporate subsidy policies to the detriment of the working class of Europe and the middle class. Their living standards have been going down, by the way, amid warmonger policies, amid policies of forever war that they followed during the Biden administration, and perpetual expansion of NATO. NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It doesn't include the entire world, yet they want no boundaries to NATO expansion. That costs money. The question is, who pays for this? The United States comes along and says, raise your defense budget from 3% for NATO contribution from 3% to 5%. That means you're going to take 2% of GDP out of the civilian economy and put it into defense, which means you're further pushing down living standards for the working class and the middle class. This is not difficult to figure out for a lot of people in Europe. They know what that means. It means militarization to further strengthen European corporations. By the way, let me point out that there are many mainstream analysts in Europe, let alone the United States, believe that yes, Europe, they agree with much of my analysis. They don't agree with my conclusions, but with much of my analysis, they would agree that yes, Europe has problems, economic problems. We got the answer for this. Something called, those of you who've studied economics know this, military Keynesianism, which means deficit spending to further strengthen the defense sector, which would have derivative effects in the civilian economy. Yeah, dreaming, in other words. The exact same military Keynesian policies the US has been following for decades that have resulted in a $37 trillion debt, okay, combined with corporate subsidies regime under both Democrats and Republicans. This is not Trump's fault, by the way. Under both Democrats and Republicans, okay, and they're on both sides. There are Republicans as well as most Democrats complaining. Where are we going with this? We're ruining the economy. Well, where they're going is they're following that deadly combination, and then they look at other countries, mainly China. It's their fault. Let's punish them with tariffs that only backfire because they are a tax on the consumer, the domestic consumer, whether it's in the United States or anywhere else. When you put tariffs on the other side, you're putting tariffs. You're raising taxes. It's a form of indirect tax on your own consumer. They're paying for it. Government of China is not going to pay anything. Anyway, these are some of the considerations. The Europeans are also well aware that Israel, as the Newsweek article just recently, by the way, published this past week, pointed out, we have there's a great public opinion poll by I think the Pew Research Center group. They took 24. I couldn't do all the countries; it's very expensive, but they took a sample of 24 countries around the world, and almost 60% of the population are against Israel. The Europeans read public opinion polls. They know what the General Assembly sentiment is. It represents the governments of the majority of the world. They know what the sentiment of their own people is and the sentiment of world public opinion. So when you put all this together, it's unsettling for them. And the question, it then becomes a cost-benefit ratio. Okay, what's the cost we're going to pay here? Because the far right wing is waiting to take over, and they want to make sure they don't take over. On the other hand, they have the Trump administration people promoting far right wing globally. Now, let's look at some statistics that I just recently looked at the casualties and the situation in Gaza. As of this month, this is June 2025, there are roughly 56,000 people officially killed in the war in Gaza, roughly 70% or so women and children, by the way, just as Senator Bernie Sanders has pointed out on the floor of the Senate when he calls for ending U.S. aid to this war. It's not just the innocent civilians that have been killed. It's that the Israeli government has also killed roughly 128 scholars, 224 aid workers, 179 United Nations staff people. These are outrageous numbers. Journalists. So when you look at the picture, and then when you have even former Israeli government officials come out and wonder out loud, well, if we don't call this what's happening over there in Gaza a case of war crimes, what terminology do we use for it? What is it? It's certainly not a conventional war. Conventional war is what happened during the Napoleonic War, World War I. Conventional forces going at it at each other. There is no conventional force on the side of the Palestinians. People can see for themselves endless videos. Children half naked running around in the mud with a can looking to fill it with fresh water, drinking water, by the way, dying of disease and starvation. That's not a conventional war. Now, one could argue, and I agree entirely with this thesis, as Howard Zinn, the late great American scholar did, and others have argued the same thing, European scholars as well, that all wars are against civilians. So why is this any different? That's true. All wars are against civilians. This one targets civilians. And that's what was litigated in court, at The Hague, at the International Court. So we have here a case litigated, brought, of course, at the forefront by South Africa, which the US, of course, holds a grudge against, because South Africa had a former apartheid regime state before Nelson Mandela, before 1993, when he took over, um, a former apartheid regime, accusing, of course, this state, the state of Israel, of being an apartheid state and engaged in ethnic cleansing. Now, there are apologists of Israel who say, well, you know, the problem is the press, it's the media, especially the Western media, constantly focusing on Israel. Let's face it, there are conflicts everywhere around the world. At any time, from small, really skirmishes to larger ones, like the one in Israel, there are about 100, 120 or so. Okay, there are. Does this absolve Israel of what it has been doing in Gaza? Does it make it any better? What kind of an argument is this? It defies logic. And it's not just people like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, and others who have argued that what we have here is a clear-cut case. It's actually anyone who is rooted in anthropocentric values, that is, human-centered values. This is about human beings. It doesn't matter if they're Palestinians and Muslims, right? It's about human beings. The same thing holds true with regard to what the Germans, the Nazis, were doing to the Jews in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Okay, this is a universal issue. This is about the human rights, a human rights issue, and it's about how the United Nations defines human rights, universal human rights. Now, Europeans are ideologically closer to Israel than they are to the Arab countries, they are to the Muslim countries. There is something to be said about the cultural divide. Europeans have, for the last 500 years, actually, some historians go back to the Crusades of the 12th century and argue Europeans have a long-standing history of being expansionist conquerors and entering into the Middle East, the areas of the Muslim world, in order to take territory and exploit. The early settlers of Israel, when the state of Israel was founded in 1948, the vast majority of the population was of European background. The Zionist ideology, those of you who are familiar with the history of Zionism, was forged during the late 19th century, during the age of imperialism, when social Darwinism, an eclectic ideology that includes nationalism, militarism, expansionism, when the social Darwinism, white superiority, these are elements that Zionists put together, but also something called the Lebensraum in German, which means living space, translated into English. The Lebensraum theory is really alive and well. The fact is, this has been at the core of Israeli policy from 1948 to the present. And the recent revelation by the Israelis themselves, by the way, okay, Israelis inside Israel, Israeli press, that there has been funding and supplying of weapons to criminal gangs in Gaza to disrupt, to cause more chaos, to disrupt humanitarian aid, to cause more chaos. And the recent actions by the Israeli government to instigate war against Iran, hitting Lebanon just recently, by the way, periodically hitting Lebanon, Syria, having expansionist schemes in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and openly, there are elements within the Israeli government that are openly advocating ethnic cleansing. Get rid of the Palestinians. Openly arguing in favor of normalizing the settler policy, which is part of ethnic cleansing and part of the Lebensraum mindset that is at the heart of Zionism. I don't want to go on too much longer. I want to end with a couple of things. A recent interview in Sky News in the United Kingdom that Matthew Miller, who, by the way, I first came to know Matthew Miller in the United States, not personally, but I saw him. I used to see him. I think he was on MSNBC. He was an analyst on some morning talk show, analyzing. And he spoke like a true Cold War liberal back then. Before he got into government, he had associations with the Obama administration. And then he was brought in by Joe Biden to be the spokesperson for the State Department. In an interview with Sky News just recently, he admitted three very startling things. Number one, that Israel is indeed guilty of genocide and war crimes. Number two, he admitted that the pro-Palestinian college protests were appropriate. Right? He also admitted, number three, that the European governments recognizing, many European governments, not all, Palestine was appropriate. This is interesting because he was asked, while in government, why is it? And I remember him, by the way, when he used to do press conferences, he had this smirk on his face when reporters honestly asked him if indeed the US was aware that there were war crimes in Gaza, and he would immediately dismiss all of that. He would sort of laugh it off and dismiss it. He would be adamantly against college kids exercising the right to free speech. He was against any government, not just Europeans, supporting Palestinians. He was asked by Sky News, what about when you were in government? Why you're saying this now that Trump is in charge? Trump is the president. What about when Biden was in office? And his answer was the same as that of former Third Reich officers during the Nuremberg trial who were asked, why did you go along with the Third Reich policies, especially with regard of the final solution toward the Jews? The final solution is what the Holocaust is commonly known as. And they answered, well, I was just following orders. In essence, he said the same thing. He was just following orders. He said that the power structure in the United States is such that it meant self-ruin if one were to oppose what the elite structure supported. He's absolutely correct. He's honest. I give him at least that. I honestly believe, although articles have been written about this, and they're critical of Mr. Miller. I believe he at least did this much. I think he has a conscience, that he found the inner strength to come out and say it was all wrong. It was, we knew, we all knew. And we knew what was right, what was wrong. And we defended this because the powers above us, going to the president, behind the president, the elite structure in the United States, this is what they wanted. The other thing that struck me, and I will end with this, and this is a breath of fresh air when I read it recently online. A young PhD candidate at the Tel Aviv University has written a fine essay. I imagine this is part of his PhD dissertation at Tel Aviv University. It's entitled "The Occupation Destroying Israel Within, and Liberals Can't Ignore It Anymore." And this young PhD candidate has a thesis that Israel today, in the 21st century, is somewhat in an analogous position as the United States before Abraham Lincoln's election, before the Dred Scott decision, which was a court case that did not recognize the legitimacy of blacks, former slave. Dred Scott was a former slave seeking freedom, to be treated as a human being, and therefore petition for his freedom. He said, well, we're not in that different. He also pointed out that what we have in Israel is that the liberal, this is hence the title of the wording in the title of his article here, "Liberals Can't Ignore This Anymore." He argued in the 19th century, the northern liberals in America felt, well, slavery, that's something that's the South problem. We don't have to deal with it. Israelis can't argue that, well, the Palestinian issue is an issue of the right wing. This is an issue that is in the Palestinian territories, the settlers' issue encroaching on Palestinian lands. Well, it has nothing to do with us. Well, the fact is, he takes a holistic approach and argues that the solution is indeed a holistic solution, and that Israeli society, has to solve this problem and find its path among civilized nations, just like the United States did in resolving the slave issue. Now, never mind that the United States, what happened after the Civil War, that the United States during the Reconstruction period, we have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, we have the rise of basically a segregated society, legalized segregated society. In other words, the legalized apartheid. So what the reason this is very important is because I believe that in the future, scholarship, some of the best scholarship about what happened with the war that Israel has been carrying out, which of course is a genocide, as Matthew Miller pointed out. Some of the best scholarship may actually come right out of Israel, out of Israeli, young Israeli thinkers, scholars, who will reflect back on what kind of society they want for themselves and for their children. I thank you for listening. I ask you to write comments, ask questions, and by all means, join this educational channel. Thank you very much. Thank you.